A deafening metallic scream tore through the damp Prussian air. It was not the sound of an explosion, but of dying metal. 30 meters from the lone IS-2 tank, the mangled carcass of a German Panzer IV burned with a low, oily flame. Its turret lay 10 paces away, a grotesque flower of torn steel. This was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse of machines, and the IS-2, named Ivan the Terrible, was the last butcher standing. Inside the tank, the world was a cacophony of receding thunder. The ears of the 5 men rang with a high-pitched whine, drowning out all but the pounding of their own hearts. The air was unbreathable, a solid mix of cordite, ozone from electrical shorts, and the sour, sweet smell of overheated metal and sweat. Commander Stvol blinked, trying to clear the dancing black spots from his vision. A thin trickle of blood from a split eyebrow traced a path through the grime on his temple. He had just watched, through his periscope, as the third and final German assault on their position evaporated under the thunderous fire of his gun. The silence that followed felt heavier, more dangerous than the battle itself. The radio crackled to life, a harsh, desperate sound. The voice from battalion command was stripped of all military formality, frayed at the edges by static and panic. "Ivan, confirm status. Report immediately." Stvol keyed the mic, his voice a dry rasp that surprised even him. Position held. 3 enemy vehicles destroyed. No infantry contact. Ammunition at 40%. A long pause, filled only with the sound of sizzling metal from outside. Then the voice returned, lower, hurried. "Reinforcements are pinned down 5 kilometers east. You are to hold that crossroads. It is the anvil. You are the anvil. Do you understand? Prevent their breakout at all costs. They are bringing up something heavy. Rail transport spotted. You must hold." The transmission cut off. Stvol slowly removed the headset. The words "something heavy" and "rail transport" hung in the poisoned air, more tangible than the smoke. He knew what that meant. Everyone in the Red Army had heard the stories whispered in dugouts at night. The monsters on railway tracks. Below him, in the driver's compartment, Serega was wrestling with his steering levers. A last, desperate shot from the Panzer IV had cratered the ground directly under their left track, jamming it with compacted earth and debris. The tank was not going anywhere. Serega's face, usually a mask of focused calm, was beaded with sweat of frustration and a dawning cold fear. They were not just an anvil. They were a stuck anvil. In the turret, the gunner, Schachmatist, was performing a frantic, almost religious ritual. He wiped the lenses of his telescopic sight with a shaking, cloth-wrapped finger. His calculated world of trajectories had just been shattered by the sheer, brute-force chaos of the point-blank engagement. His left eyelid developed a persistent, nervous twitch. Next to him, the loader Vitya was slumped against the breech of the massive 122mm gun, his chest heaving. His youthful belief in their tank's invincibility had been replaced by the visceral physical terror of the last hit that had rocked the 46-ton machine like a toy. The bronze casing of the spent shell at his feet was still too hot to touch, radiating heat like a tiny sun. In the rear, the radio operator Medved was pressing a filthy bandage against a deep gash on the arm of their machine gunner, who was breathing in short, sharp gasps. The Siberian's usual immovable solidity was now the solidity of a cliff face eroding under a storm. His eyes, when they met Stvol's through the gloom, held a single unspoken question. What now? Stvol did not have an answer. He gave orders, his voice regaining its flat, iron control. They would turn their immobility into a fortress. Vitya and Medved were to dismount, under covering fire from the coaxial machine gun, and lay out the last of the anti-personnel mines in a half-circle before their bow. They would camouflage the tank not to hide it, but to break its silhouette, to make aiming for weak spots harder. They would redistribute ammunition, placing the precious high-explosive shells for the coming infantry within easiest reach. As Vitya, pale but determined, pushed open the heavy hatch, the true silence of the field struck them. No birds, no insects, just the crackle of flames and the moan of the wind through the shattered trees of the distant forest. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Stvol scanned the tree line with his binoculars. He saw no movement, no glint of glass, but he saw something else. Through the skeletal branches, far, far in the distance, he could make out a faint, perpendicular line against the gray sky. A railway embankment, and then a new sound. Faint, carried on the wind. Not a weapon. A deep, resonant, metallic clang, like the sound of a colossal vault door being unlocked. It echoed once across the empty fields and died. Inside Ivan the Terrible, every man froze. Serega stopped his work on the tracks. Shachmatist's eye stopped twitching, frozen wide. Vitya, halfway out of the hatch, looked back at Stvol, his face a mask of pure, primal dread. Stvol lowered his binoculars. His knuckles were white around them. The puzzle pieces of the desperate radio call, the panicked German retreat from a winning position, the unnatural silence, and that single industrial sound from the rails locked together with terrifying finality. They were not just an anvil awaiting a hammer. They were the target on the firing range of a giant. Time ceased to flow in linear minutes. It became a thick, viscous substance measured in heartbeats, in the slow crawl of sweat down a spine, in the shared, shallow breaths that fogged the cold steel of the tank's interior. The single monstrous clang from the railway had activated a primal circuit in each man's brain. They were no longer soldiers in a battle. They were prey that had just heard the hunter's rifle bolt slide home. The work of fortification was completed with a frantic, silent urgency. Vitya and Medved moved like ghosts outside the tank, their boots making no sound in the churned mud. They placed the circular greenish PTM anti-personnel mines with trembling hands, their eyes darting constantly toward the dark line of the forest and the spectral railway embankment beyond. Each mine was a promise of a future explosion, a tiny, desperate claim on territory. Returning to the tank felt like entering a tomb that might become their coffin. The heavy hatch closing behind them was a sound of terrifying finality. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed. The earlier exhaustion was burned away by a clean, cold surge of adrenaline. Now, a meticulous, almost obsessive routine took hold. This was their ritual against the looming unknown. Stvol divided the world into sectors, his voice a low, continuous monotone, assigning each man a slice of hell to watch. Serega, from his driver's periscope, scanned the dead ground immediately before them, where the earth was scarred by tracks and craters. Shachmatist, his twitch gone, replaced by an unnatural frozen calm, slowly traversed the immense gun barrel a fraction of a degree at a time, his right eye glued to the TSH-17 sight, dissecting the tree line into individual branches, shadows, and potential lies. Stvol himself took the most terrible duty, observation of the railway. Through his binoculars, the embankment was a smear of gray, He searched for the telltale shape of a flat car, for the angular silhouette of a gargantuan barrel. He saw nothing, and that was worse. The imagination, fueled by fatigue and the whispered legends of the Dora gun, painted far more horrifying pictures than reality could supply. He imagined a cannon so large it blotted out the sky, a slug of steel the size of a small car arcing silently toward them. Vitya's role was internal. In the dim red battle light, he became the keeper of the shrine. He checked and rechecked the massive 122mm shells, his fingers tracing the cold, painted bodies of the high-explosive fragmentation rounds. He counted the charges, the brass casings. He knew their remaining arsenal down to the last pistol cartridge. His earlier terror sublimated into a focused, manic energy. Each shell was a potential answer, a piece of their defiance. He arranged them by type, creating a deadly taxonomy within the steel belly of their beast. Medved, having tended to the wounded machine gunner, who now lay dozing fitfully on a tarpaulin, prepared their last line of defense. He loaded belts for the Degtyaryov machine gun, the heavy, gleaming rounds clicking together with a sound like falling coins. He checked the submachine guns, the F1 grenades, the lemons. These were for if the steel walls were breached. This was the geometry of their world, the outer circle of mines, the middle circle of the mighty gun, the inner circle of small arms, and at the center the 5 of them. An hour passed, then another. The tension was not a peak, but a high, unbearable plateau. Muscles ached from being held rigid. Eyes stung from unblinking scrutiny. The silence was no longer empty. It was a pressurized container, filling with the unspoken thoughts of each man. It was Sariga who broke the silence, his voice a strained whisper from the driver's compartment. Movement. 11 o'clock. In the crater. The big one. All attention snapped to the left. Shachmatist's turret rotated with a barely audible electric whine, infinitesimally slow. Stvol raised his binoculars. There, in the shadow of a shell crater 60 meters out, something had shifted. A piece of earth that was not earth. A gray-green cloth, a helmet, a lone German soldier, a scout. He was not advancing. He was observing, mapping their position with methodical, professional slowness. He had a rangefinder. He was not looking at the tank in general. He was studying its exact placement, the angle of its hull, the depth of its tracks in the mud. He was collecting data. A cold understanding settled over Stvol. This was not a prelude to an infantry assault. This was target acquisition. The lone scout was a single nerve ending for a distant, colossal brain. Every minute he spent there, measuring, meant that the monstrous weapon on the rails was being fed coordinates. They were being painted. The urge to erase that scout, to vaporize him with a machine gun burst, was a physical pain in Stvol's gut. But he remained still. A shot would reveal their exact defensive capability, their alertness. It would confirm the scout's data. It was a test of nerve. Shachmatist, Stvol whispered, the words dust dry. Mark the crater. Exact range. Hold. The gunner's finger hovered over the trigger guard. His crosshairs rested on the edge of the crater, just above the shadow where the helmet moved. He breathed out, halfway, and stopped. The world narrowed to the circle of his sight. He calculated the drop of a high-explosive shell over 60 meters, the fragmentation cone. He could turn that crater into a grave. They watched. For 3 endless minutes, they watched the enemy note-taker work. It was a violation more intimate than any charge. Finally, The scout began to withdraw, slithering backward like a reptile into a fold in the earth, disappearing from sight. He was gone, but he had taken their measure with him. The knowledge settled inside Ivan the Terrible like a lead weight. The ritual was over. The waiting had a new crystalline quality. The hunter knew where they were. The only question that remained, hanging in the foul air, was the nature of the weapon he would use. And when the first shot of that weapon would come from the distant, silent rails, and what sound it would make before it erased their world. The tension inside the steel hull became a living entity. It was a sixth crew member, invisible and suffocating, pressing against their chests, constricting their throats, making the recycled air taste of copper and dread. The departure of the scout did not bring relief. It snapped the last fragile thread of uncertainty. The hunt was now in its final, irrevocable stage. They were the fixed point on a map in some distant artillery command post, a crosshair drawn over their souls. Stovall made a decision. Waiting to be hit was a form of psychological suicide. They had to move, even if the tank could not. He issued quiet, rapid orders, breaking the paralytic spell. Shachmatist was to perform a continuous, slow traverse of the entire horizon with the main gun, a deliberate display of vigilance. Sarega, despite the immobilized tracks, was to engage the auxiliary engine to vent fumes and create the illusion of readiness, the low grumble a heartbeat for their metal beast. Activity, however futile, was a weapon against despair. Vitya and Medved were given the most critical task. Using periscopes and pistol ports, they began a systematic scan of the distant railway embankment and the forest's edge with a new purpose, not just to spot movement, but to find a target. Anything. A command post, an observation vehicle, a fuel depot. They needed to force the enemy to react, to disrupt the meticulous killing equation being prepared for them. 37 minutes after the scout vanished, Medved saw it. His voice, usually a low rumble, was sharp. Smoke. 2 fingers left of the railway junction. Black, then gray, industrial. Not a cooking fire. All optics swung to the location. Through the shimmer of heat and distance, a thin, dark column rose, then turned into a wider, grayer plume. It was the wrong color for a burning vehicle. It was the smoke of a large coal-fired engine, a locomotive. The confirmation was a physical blow. The railway gun was not a phantom. It was present, and it was being serviced, fueled, made ready. The monstrous clang now had a source. A wave of pure, primal fear washed through the compartment, cold and electric. Vitya's hands trembled so violently he had to clutch a shell strap to steady them. Sarega closed his eyes for a long second, his face pale. It was Shachmatist who transformed the fear. He stopped his panoramic sweep. With glacial slowness, he centered the enormous blunt snout of the D-25T gun on the distant smudge of smoke. He began to calculate, muttering numbers under his breath, an incantation against the impossible. Wind estimate, distance, an extreme range far beyond the prescribed effective use of a tank gun. A lottery shot. But it was a shot. "Commander," he said, his voice eerily detached, "I have an indirect fire solution. Estimate the locomotive or its support area. Using high explosive. Probability is low." Stovall understood. This was not about destruction. It was about defiance. It was about injecting a variable of chaos into the enemy's perfect plan. It was about forcing the giant to flinch. "Load high explosive. Prepare for ranging shot." Vitya moved with frantic strength. hefting the 25-kilogram shell, sliding it into the breech with a solid, echoing clunk, then following with the separate powder charge. The ritual of loading, the sheer physicality of it, grounded him. Medved braced himself against the radio set. "Fire," Stvol said. The world inside the tank dissolved into sound and violence. The blast was cataclysmic, a deafening, crushing boom that compressed their organs. The massive gun recoiled violently, the entire 46-ton machine shifting in its muddy cradle. A flash of demonic light illuminated the interior for an instant, followed by a rolling cloud of acrid smoke that burned their eyes and throats. Through his periscope, Stvol watched the arc of the tracer, a dying red star soaring impossibly high, then plummeting earthward. It fell short. A geyser of black earth and smoke erupted 500 meters this side of the railway embankment. A harmless explosion in an empty field. But it was not harmless. For a long moment, nothing. Then the forest awoke, not with infantry, but with fire. A hurricane of retaliation erupted from hidden positions they had not suspected. The air outside shredded. A barrage of mortar shells walked the field around them, the concussions slamming against the tank's armor like the fists of gods. High-velocity anti-tank gun shells shrieked past, one scoring a bright, molten scar across the front glacis plate with a scream of tortured metal. Machine gun fire pattered against the hull like sudden, furious hail. They had stirred the hornet's nest. The enemy was revealing its defensive layers, trying to suppress them, to blind them before the main event. Stvol shouted over the hellish din, "Target the anti-tank gun! Flash at 10 o'clock! Shachmatist! Fire!" Chaos became their drill. The roar of their own gun became a metronome of survival. Shachmatist, operating in a trance of focus, engaged the revealed threats. A second shell screamed toward the anti-tank gun's muzzle flash. The explosion was answered by silence, a direct hit, or a crippling near-miss. Vitya loaded, sweated, loaded again, his world reduced to the rhythmic dance of shell, charge, breach, duck. But the German fire was not meant to destroy them. It was a screen, a violent curtain of noise and dirt. And behind that curtain the main actor was making its entrance. As a lull fell in the direct fire, the German gunners shifting or reloading, a new sound penetrated the ringing in their ears. It started as a deep, subsonic vibration, felt in the bones more than heard. It was the sound of immense, heavy machinery moving on rails. A slow, rhythmic clanking that carried across the kilometers with unnatural clarity. Clang. Silence. Clang. Silence. Each impact was a beat in a funeral march. Then, a different mechanical sound cut through. A high-pitched electric whine, the sound of massive hydraulic motors and gears engaging. It was the sound of a titan preparing to strike. Stvol, his face streaked with soot and sweat, looked through his periscope. At the distant railway embankment, he saw it now. Not the gun itself, but the movement. A huge, angular shadow, previously camouflaged, was now rotating with deliberate, glacial slowness. It was aligning itself. The long, dark line of the barrel, like the finger of a dead god, was slowly, inexorably lowering. It was pointing directly at them. The preparatory fire ceased abruptly. The mortars, the machine guns, fell silent. A profound, sacred quiet descended over the battlefield, broken only by that relentless, hydraulic whine and the pounding of blood in their ears. The giant had found its aim. The geometry was complete. The anvil waited. The hammer was poised at the apex of its swing. The next sound would be the last thing they would ever hear. The world contracted to a single, terrible axis, a line drawn in space from the distant, whispering hydraulics to the heart of their steel prison. Time did not slow. It shattered into 1,000,000 crystalline shards, each containing a microcosm of sensation, thought, and pure instinct. The first warning was not a sound, but a pressure. The air itself seemed to thicken, to congeal around the Ivan the Terrible, as if the atmosphere was being squeezed out of the path of something unspeakably vast. Inside the tank, a primal silence fell, deeper than any quiet before. It was the silence of 5 men holding their breath at the edge of the abyss. Then came the sound from the railway. It was not the sharp, percussive crack of their own gun, nor the shriek of a conventional shell. It was a deep, tectonic whump that originated below the register of hearing and climbed into the bones. A sound of the earth itself being torn. It rolled across the distance not as a wave, but as a wall, a physical force that struck the tank's exterior armor a fraction of a second before the projectile arrived. What followed was not an explosion. It was an act of cosmic violence, a negation of physics as they knew it. The 280-millimeter high explosive shell, a mass of steel and terror heavier than a small car, struck the upper front glacis of the IS-2 with the force of a meteor. There was no piercing, no clean penetration. The sloped armor, designed to deflect shots, met a force that did not deflect. It yielded. The impact was a light beyond light. A sun ignited 1 meter from Stvol's face, blinding and absolute, flooding the compartment with an apocalyptic white fury that burned through closed eyelids. The sound was the end of all sounds, a single all-consuming gong that was less a noise and more the annihilation of silence. It was the bell toll of their own death. Inside the tank, reality dissolved. The shock wave was a living thing. It traveled through the armor, through the frame, through every bolt and weld, and into the men. It was not a jolt. It was a transformation of matter. The air became a solid fist, punching into lungs, driving ribs against spines. Eardrums collapsed inward, not with a pop, but with a final wet surrender. Blood vessels burst in eyes, in noses, painting dark constellations across faces, slammed into whatever metal lay behind them. Sarega, in his driver's seat, took the force head-on. The concussion traveled up the immobilized tracks, through the final drive, and into his body. His head snapped forward, his leather helmet offering no protection against the inertial violence that whipped his skull into the iron periscope housing. A dark, shapeless bloom of red and gray flowered on the cold steel. Vitya, standing closest to the point of impact, was lifted off his feet. He did not fly. He was erased from his position by the blast of air and secondary shrapnel. Scalding fragments of their own inner armor spalling off in a deadly cloud. He was thrown against the gun breech, his body folding with a terrible soft crunch of breaking bones, before slumping into a limp heap. The tank itself performed a grotesque dance. The entire colossal machine, 46 tons of forged steel, was lifted from the ground on its left side. It rose, hovered for an impossible moment, suspended on a pillar of force and flame, then slammed back down into the mud with a final, earth-shaking thud. The hull rang like a gong struck by a god, a sustained, deafening peal that vibrated in their teeth, in their souls. Inside, the world was now a hell of inverted senses. Silence, a profound, absolute, ringing silence. The universe had gone mute. Then, the secondary sounds seeped in. The hiss of superheated metal cooling, the ping and creak of tortured steel settling, the drip of fluids, oil, water, blood. The electrical systems died, plunging them into a darkness stained only by the faint, hellish orange glow from outside, bleeding through vision blocks and cracks. Smell assaulted them next. The acrid, choking stench of burnt explosives and ozone was overwhelmed by a new, metallic, coppery smell. The smell of freshly spalled armor, of vaporized paint, and beneath it, the sickly sweet, unmistakable scent of seared meat and opened intestines. Stvol regained consciousness, not with a start, but with a slow, drowning return to agony. He was on the floor of the commander's station, his body a single unified scream of pain. His head felt split open, his vision a tunnel of swirling gray and red. He tried to breathe and coughed, a wet, ragged sound that brought a taste of iron to his mouth. He was bleeding internally. Through the haze, his commander's instinct flickered. He tried to move. His left arm refused, hanging at a wrong angle. A compound fracture, bone gleaming white in the gloom. He used his right arm to push himself up against the cold, strangely textured wall. The armor was no longer smooth. It was a landscape of sharp, inward-peeled petals of steel where the shell had fused and shattered on impact, leaving a crater the size of a wash basin on the outside, and a corresponding nightmare of fragmentation on the inside. He looked around his metal coffin. Shachmatist was slumped over his sight, motionless. Medved was stirring in the rear, a dark stream pouring from his nose and ears, his eyes wide and uncomprehending in the dark, blinking slowly as if waking from a deep sleep. Of Sarega and Vitya, he could see only tangled, still forms. They were not dead. The tank was not dead. But they were no longer a crew. They were survivors in a shattered steel cave, buried alive. The miracle of their survival was a cruel, immediate torture. The pressure in Stvol's ears began to equalize, and the first thing he heard clearly was not the enemy, but a low, broken moan. It took him a full minute to realize the sound was coming from his own throat. The impact was over. The aftermath, a more intimate and prolonged horror, had just begun. The world outside, the war, the enemy, it all ceased to exist. There was only the tomb, the pain, and the crushing weight of the impossible truth. They had been hit by the hammer of a giant. And they were still, unbelievably, agonizingly, alive. Consciousness was not a gift, but a sentence. It returned to each surviving man as a separate, exquisite punishment, meted out in the absolute dark and the ringing silence of their shared tomb. Stvol's world was a narrow cylinder of agony. Each breath was a knife drawn across shattered ribs. The coppery taste of blood filled his mouth, a constant, intimate reminder of the internal damage. His broken arm hung useless, a lump of frozen fire at his side. He focused on the pain. It was an anchor. It was proof he was still alive in this metal hell. With a grunt that ripped from his throat, he used his good arm to pull himself upright against the commander's seat. The act of rising was a monumental climb. His vision swam, the darkness speckled with angry, pulsating stars. He had to assess. He had to know the dimensions of their grave. His hearing was returning in distorted fragments. The high-pitched whine in his ears was a constant tone. But beneath it, he began to distinguish the sounds of the tomb. A slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from somewhere near the engine firewall, coolant or fuel. a deeper, labored breathing that was not his own, and a soft, wet, bubbling sound that made his stomach clench. He fumbled for the emergency battle lantern, its familiar location now a maze in the dark. His fingers, numb and clumsy, finally closed over the cold handle. He clicked the switch. Nothing. He cursed, a dry, soundless rasp. The electrical system was dead. The darkness was absolute. Then, from the driver's compartment, a weak, guttural sound. A choke. A struggle for air. Sarega. Stvol's mind snapped into a sharp, clinical focus. The pain receded to a background hum. He had a man down. He began to move, a slow, torturous crab walk down from his station. Every movement sent fresh bolts of lightning through his chest. The floor of the tank was a treacherous landscape. It was littered with sharp, twisted metal, the inward jagged flowers of spalled armor. Shell casings, tools, personal kits, all thrown into a chaotic slurry by the impact. And it was slick with oil, with coolant, with other darker fluids that reflected no light. He reached Sarega. The emergency glow from a cracked and dying periscope offered a sliver of illumination. It was enough. Sarega was pinned. The concussion had not just slammed him into the housing, it had warped the entire driver's control assembly. A thick steel lever, the gear shift, was bent like a pretzel and jammed against his lower abdomen, pinning him to his seat. His face was a mask of blood from the head wound, but his eyes were open, wide with a terror that was beyond pain. He was drowning in his own blood, a pink froth bubbling at his lips with each shallow, desperate gasp. A ruptured lung, internal bleeding. He was dying, and he knew it. Stvol's medical training was basic. Tourniquets, bandages, morphine. This was a field surgeon's nightmare. He had nothing. No way to move the metal, no way to seal the lung. He found Sarega's hand in the dark, gripping it. The driver's grip was weak, frantic. Stvol leaned close, his face inches from Sarega's. "Hold on," he mouthed, the words a voiceless breath. "Just hold on." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But the lie was the only medicine he had. A beam of light cut through the gloom. Medved. The Siberian had recovered enough to find a working flashlight. The beam was shaky, illuminating swirling motes of dust and smoke. It swept the compartment, revealing the full horror. Vitya was gone, not unconscious. Gone. The young loader's body lay partially under the gun breech, but the upper half was unrecognizable, a ruin of torn cloth and crimson pulp. The secondary spalling from the impact had turned the inside of the armor into a shotgun blast. He had taken the full force of it. Shachmatist was alive. The gunner was slumped, but as the light hit him, he stirred. He raised a trembling hand to his face, his fingers coming away from his eyes wet. Not tears. Blood from burst vessels. He was blind, his world of precise angles and crosshairs replaced by a permanent swirling crimson fog. He began to whimper, a low animal sound of utter disorientation and loss. Medved himself was a walking wound. One side of his face was a livid bruise, his ear a ragged mess. He moved with a stiff, pained limp, but his eyes, when they met Stvol's in the flashlight beam, held not panic, but a grim, exhausted determination. He was the only one still functionally mobile. The light was a blessing and a curse. It revealed their predicament in stark, unforgiving detail. They were entombed. The main hatch above the driver was warped, its mechanism jammed solid. The turret, when Medved tried the traverse, gave a sickening grind and did not budge. It was locked in place, twisted on its ring by the force of the impact. The engine was dead. The radio was a silent box of shattered vacuum tubes. They were buried in 60 tons of steel in the middle of a battlefield. And then, the sounds from outside began to filter in, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. The crunch of boots on gravel, guttural, cautious shouts in German. The enemy was coming. They were approaching the smoking, ruined hulk of the tank, confident that nothing within could have survived the judgment of their railway god. They were coming to survey their handiwork, to claim trophies, perhaps to capture a crew if by some miracle one lived. Stvol looked around his tomb, at the dying Sarega, whose breathing was becoming more shallow, more wet, at the blinded, whimpering Shachmatist, at the battered but resolute Medved, at the remains of Vitya. He looked at the crater in the armor, at the light from outside seeping through the cracks in the steel petals. They had a choice. They could wait. They could die quietly in the dark as the Germans arrived, sparing themselves the final indignity. Or they could fight. Not for victory, not for survival, but for one last defiant act. To make the enemy pay for opening this tomb. Stvol caught Medved's eye. He gestured with his good hand toward the coaxial machine gun, then toward the breech of the main gun. A silent question hung in the foul, blood-tinged air. Medved understood. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. He passed the flashlight to Stvol, then turned, bracing his wounded body against the radio set. He began the Herculean task of manually checking the loading mechanism of the Degtyaryov, his big hands moving with deliberate, painful care. They would not die as victims in a coffin. They would die as the crew of the Ivan the Terrible. They would make their tomb a fortress for one last, shocking ambush. The Germans thought they were approaching a corpse. They were about to stick their hand into a nest of wounded, cornered scorpions. The inside of the tank was no longer a compartment. It was the inner chamber of a wounded beast holding its breath. The only sounds were the death rattle in Sarega's chest, a wet, rhythmic struggle that filled the dark space, and the soft, metallic clicks and snicks as Medved, working by feel and memory, prepared their weapons. Every sound was magnified, a potential betrayal. Stvol, cradling his shattered arm, had extinguished the flashlight. They operated in a darkness now streaked with thin, accusing blades of daylight piercing through the new cracks and deformities in their armor. Stvol's world had narrowed to a single burning point of focus, the periscope in his commander's cupola. It was cracked, its optics blurred, but it was their one eye to the outside world. He had to stand on unsteady legs, his body screaming in protest, and press his good eye against the cold rubber eyepiece. The view was a fractured, watery mess, but he could see shapes. Gray-green shapes moving with cautious confidence through the smoke-hazed field. The Germans were advancing not as a storming party, but as a burial detail. They moved in two loose groups, rifles slung, some with cameras, others with toolkits. They believed they were approaching a monument to their own overwhelming firepower, a smoking trophy. Their body language spoke of relief, of morbid curiosity. One officer, identifiable by the cut of his coat, pointed at the tank, gesturing with academic interest at the massive, smoldering crater on its glacis plate. They were within 80 meters, then 60. Stvol tracked them, his breath fogging the broken glass. He was a puppeteer with broken strings, orchestrating a final bloody act. He glanced down into the gloom. Medved, a hulking shadow, gave a single slow nod. The coaxial Degtyaryov was loaded, its bolt locked back. The mechanism of the main gun, however, was a problem. The hit had warped the turret ring just enough to bind the elevation mechanism. The mighty 122mm gun was frozen, its barrel stuck at a slightly elevated angle, useless for direct fire at approaching infantry. But Shachmatist, in his blindness, had found a new purpose. Guided by Stvol's whispered reports of distance and direction, his hands, those precise instruments of death, were now performing a last calculation. He felt his way around the gunner's controls, his fingers tracing familiar knobs and wheels now made alien. He was setting the sight for indirect fire for a target he could not see, using numbers fed to him by a commander who could barely stand. He was programming a ghost shot. 40 meters. The Germans were spreading out. 2 soldiers approached the left flank, their eyes on the immobilized tracks, their expressions almost pitying. One of them, a young man with a scavenged Russian ushanka on his head, reached out and patted the tank's dented side skirt, laughing at something his companion said. Stvol's good hand, slick with sweat and blood, found the commander's override for the coaxial machine gun. His finger hovered over the trigger button. He waited. He needed them closer. He needed the shock to be absolute. 30 meters. The officer and a small group were now directly in front of the tank, examining the impact crater. One technician produced a steel tape measure, calling out numbers to another who scribbled in a notebook. They were performing an autopsy on what they believed to be a corpse. Now. Stvol mashed the trigger. The silence of the field was annihilated by the vicious, ripping snarl of the 7.62mm machine gun. Flame lanced from the Degtyaryov's port in the glacis plate. The technician with the tape measure disintegrated in a spray of red mist, his body cut in half by the point-blank burst. The officer spun, a line of crimson holes stitched across his chest. The Germans froze for a single petrified second, their brains utterly unable to process the information. The corpse was shooting back. Then chaos. Panicked shouts. Soldiers threw themselves to the ground, scrambling for cover that did not exist in the open field. The 2 men near the tracks were cut down as Medved, now on the hull machine gun, traversed the fire with brutal efficiency. The neat burial detail became a screaming, scrambling massacre. But the shock was temporary. German discipline reasserted itself. From the ground, from behind the burning wreck of the Panzer IV, rifle and machine pistol fire erupted. Bullets pinged and spanged against the IS-2's hull, a furious, bees-warm response. They could not penetrate, but they were searching for the vision blocks, the cracks, trying to blind and suffocate the beast. Stvol ducked as a bullet starred the glass of his periscope, leaving a spider web of cracks. He ignored it. The first part of the ambush was over. They had dealt their surprise. Now came the true defiance. He looked down at Shachmatist. The blind gunner's hands were raised, thumbs up. The solution was set. It was a guess, a prayer, a mathematical spit into the wind. The target was not the infantry. It was the assumed command post or observer position near the railway that had directed this hell upon them. Medved, load! Stvol's voice was a raw shred of sound. Medved abandoned the machine gun, turning to the monumental task. He was alone. The shell weighed 25 kilograms. The charge was separate. His body was a litany of pain. He grunted, heaving the high explosive projectile into the dark maw of the breach. The sound of its seating was a dull, comforting thud. He followed with the powder charge. He slammed the breech block closed, the heavy mechanism locking with a final, resonant clunk that felt like the ceiling of a tomb. Stvol took a final look through the shattered periscope. He saw the Germans regrouping, calling for heavier weapons, for Panzerfausts. Their confusion had turned into cold, focused rage. They would not be humiliated by a dead tank. He didn't care. He reached for the firing cable. His hand connected with Schachmatist's, which was already there, guiding him. Together, Blind Man and Broken Commander, they pulled. The gun fired. The blast in the confined, ruined space was even more savage than before. It was a hammer blow on a cracked bell. The concussion punched the air from Stvol's lungs, tore a cry from his throat. The tank, already settled in its grave, shuddered violently. A shower of rust, paint flakes, and dust rained down from the ceiling. For a moment, Stvol believed they had finished what the railway gun started, that they had cracked their own hull open. Then, silence again, broken by the frantic ringing in their ears and the renewed, furious, small arms fire from outside. They waited. There was no way to observe the fall of their shot. It was an act of faith. They had hurled their last, best insult into the void. And the void answered. Not with an explosion they could hear, but with a sudden dramatic shift in the enemy's behavior. The small arms fire from the Germans stuttered, then died away completely. Shouts changed tone, from aggressive commands to sharp, alarmed cries. Through the broken periscope, Stvol saw the gray-green figures not advancing, but retreating. Not in an orderly fashion, but in a sudden, confused scramble. They were running away from the tank, back toward the tree line, dragging their wounded, abandoning equipment. Their ghost shot, their blind, desperate prayer, had found a mark. It had not necessarily destroyed anything vital, but it had landed close enough, perhaps amid the railway gun's support vehicles, perhaps near its observation post, to shatter the enemy's sense of invincible superiority. It had told them a terrifying, impossible truth. The beast they had killed was not only still alive, it was still dangerous. It could still reach out and strike from its grave. The Ivan the Terrible lay silent once more, wreathed in smoke, its hull a testament to impossible survival. But inside, the crew understood the new calculus. They had traded their last shell for a moment of psychological victory. They had stunned the hunter. But they had also guaranteed his return, next time not with a burial detail, but with a demolition team. The shock was over. The final grinding end was now inevitable. They had merely chosen the manner of their dying, not as passive victims, but as a ghost that had just whispered a threat with its final breath. The retreat of the German infantry did not bring peace. It brought a more profound, more calculating silence. The frantic energy of the ambush bled away, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion deeper than any they had known. The tank was no longer a vessel of war. It was a decaying organ, its interior fouled with the stink of death, cordite, and fear. Sariga's breathing had stopped. The only sound from the driver's compartment was the slow, final drip of fluids onto metal. Another member of their family gone, swallowed by the steel. Schachmatist sat motionless in his gunner's seat, his unseeing eyes aimed forward, tears of blood and despair tracing clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. He was a weapon now, without a sight. Stvol clung to his periscope, his body a tapestry of pain held together by sheer, fraying will. The world through the cracked glass was a haze of smoke and early evening gloom. The Germans were gone from the immediate field, but the forest edge seethed with new, ominous activity. He could see figures moving with purpose, not panic. The antenna of a command vehicle, the flash of binoculars from a new, better concealed position. They were not giving up. They were recalibrating. The psychological victory of their last shot was evaporating, replaced by a cold, tactical reality. They had revealed their last trick. They had one machine gun with limited ammunition, a blind gunner, a loader's corpse, and a commander who could barely stand. They had bought time, but only the most cruel and temporary kind. Then, the methodical punishment began. It did not come with the world-ending fury of the railway gun. It came with the cold, professional precision of a surgeon dismantling a specimen. A single 75mm anti-tank shell screamed out of the tree line, striking the ground 10 meters to their right, gouging a deep furrow in the earth. A ranging shot. Seconds later, another, closer, 5 meters left. They were being bracketed. Stivol understood the message. The enemy was no longer trying for a killing blow. They were demonstrating their control. They were proving they could hit the immobilized tank at will, from a safe distance, with weapons they had not yet needed to reveal. The duel was over. This was an execution, drawn out to break not just their hull, but their spirit. The next shell struck the frontal glacis plate, a hand's breadth from the colossal crater left by the railway gun. The impact was a violent, ringing clang that resonated through the metal, a painful reminder of their vulnerability. A shower of sparks erupted outside the vision blocks. The shock was lesser, but it was a fresh violation, a poke at a mortal wound. Medved, slumped by the radio, looked up at Stivol. No words were needed. The question hung in the toxic air. Was this it? Were they to sit and be hammered into scrap, feeling each blow, waiting for one to finally find a weak spot, to cook off their remaining ammunition, to turn their tomb into a furnace? Stivol's gaze remained fixed outside. He watched as a German half-track emerged from the tree line, keeping a respectful kilometer distance. On its back, a familiar, long-barreled shape, a 88mm flak gun, being deployed in a direct-fire role, the king of German anti-tank weapons. It was an insult. They were bringing a scalpel to finish what the sledgehammer had started. But as the 88mm crew began their unhurried setup, Stivol's eye, trained by years of survival, caught a different movement. Further back, near the railway embankment, a plume of white steam burst against the gray sky. The locomotive was moving, not forward but back. It was shuffling, adjusting, and the long, dark shadow of the railway gun itself was slowly, almost imperceptibly, traversing. It was not pointing at them anymore. A jolt of ice shot through Stivol's veins, cutting through the pain fog. He understood. The 88mm, the ranging shots, they were not the main event. They were a distraction, a brutal, attention-grabbing spectacle to keep their eyes fixed on the immediate threat. The real monster was repositioning. Why? He followed the impossible line of the railway gun's new bearing, his mind racing over the crude map of the battlefield in his head. The gun was not aiming for them. It was aiming past them. It was targeting the road behind their position, the route their reinforcements were supposed to take, the lifeline they had been ordered to hold open. The realization was more terrifying than any direct threat to his own life. Their entire sacrifice, the deaths of Serega and Vitya, their agonized endurance, It was about to be rendered meaningless. The railway gun would obliterate the crossroads, seal the route, and ensure the German breakout. They had failed. Not by dying, but by surviving as a lure, a fixed point that had drawn the monster's gaze away from the real strategic target. A raw, animal scream of frustration tore from Stvol's throat, a sound of pure, undiluted rage that shocked even him. It was not a scream of fear, but of betrayal. By the enemy's cunning, by the cruelty of fate, by his own helplessness. That scream broke the paralysis. Schachmatist jerked in his seat at the sound. Medved pushed himself upright, his battered face a question. Stvol abandoned the periscope, sliding down into the blood-slick floor. He crawled to the breech of the main gun, ignoring the agony in his ribs. He pointed a trembling, bloody finger at it, then toward the rear of the tank, in the rough direction of the railway gun. His eyes wide and desperate, locked with Medved's. The message was impossible, insane. The main gun was frozen. The turret would not traverse. To aim at the railway gun now, they would have to move the entire tank. A tank with a shattered left track jammed in a crater. Medved stared, comprehension dawning, followed by a look of utter disbelief. Stvol was not suggesting they fight. He was suggesting they perform a miracle. He was suggesting they use the only weapon they had left, the tank's own dead weight and its last shell, to change the geometry of the battlefield one final time. They would have to align the hull itself by brute force to bring the frozen gun to bear. They would have to become the turret. With a grim, almost spiritual resolve, Medved nodded. He moved to Serega's body, whispering a silent apology as he unbuckled the dead driver from his seat. He heaved the limp form aside and squeezed himself into the cramped, blood-soaked driver's compartment. He grasped the steering levers. The left track was dead, jammed. But the right track might still have power if he could bypass the shattered electrical systems and engage the emergency mechanical linkages. Outside, the 88mm fired. The shell hit the upper hull with a deafening bell-like crash. A vision block shattered, letting in a dagger of cold light and a gust of air. Schachmatist cried out, clutching his ears. Stvol ignored it. He was at the gunner's station, his good hand on the manual elevation wheel. He would have to aim by guesswork, by memory, by feeling the angle of the hull. He was now the eyes, the brain, and the gunner of a weapon system that no longer existed. Medved strained. He fought with the manual override, muscles corded in his neck, sweat mixing with the blood on his face. There was a shudder, a deep, metallic groan from the bowels of the tank. Then, with a shriek of protesting metal, the right track moved. Just an inch. Then another. The tank, embedded in the earth, began a grotesque lurching pivot around its dead left side, like a dying animal turning its head. Each centimeter of movement was a symphony of agony for the machine and the men inside. The 88mm fired again, and again, methodically, punishingly. A hit on the turret side rocked them. Another shell struck the road wheel assembly, shearing metal. But Medved kept the pressure on, his world reduced to the feel of the lever, the sound of the grinding track. Stvol watched through a remaining periscope as the forest and the railway embankment began to slide across his field of view. He was turning the entire, crippled tank. He was aligning the frozen spear for a single, desperate joust with the Titan. The railway gun's silhouette grew larger in his limited view. It was almost in position. He could see the tiny figures of its crew, specks in the distance, preparing for the fire mission that would doom their entire battalion. He screamed at Medved to stop. The hull locked into its new, awkward angle. The main gun, frozen in elevation, was now pointing roughly, impossibly, in the direction of the railway monster. There would be no ranging shot, no calculations. There was one shell left in the breach. A high explosive shell meant for soft targets, not for dueling steel giants at extreme range. It was a pebble against a mountain. Stvol's hand found the firing cable. He did not look at Shachmatist, at Medved, at the corpses of his friends. He looked only at the distant, arrogant shape of the gun that had killed them. He pulled. The gun roared its last defiant word. The tank shuddered, a final convulsive spasm. The shell, their last breath, arced into the twilight sky, a faint tracer against the darkening blue, a hopeless prayer hurled at a god of iron. The duel of the damned was complete. The final thunderous report of their own gun echoed into a profound and sudden void. The residual ringing in their ears was the only sound, a private tinnitus that sealed them in a bubble of aftermath. The tank, having expelled its last breath, settled into a final terminal stillness. The right track, abused beyond endurance in its last pivot, gave a final metallic sigh and locked solid. The Ivan the Terrible was now truly a monument, fixed forever in its defiant, twisted pose. Stvol slumped against the gunner's seat, the last of his strength spent. There was nothing left to do, no levers to pull, no orders to give. The shell was gone. They had thrown their last stone at the giant. He did not bother with the periscope. Watching the fall of the shot was a luxury for men who still had a future. He simply waited for the response, for the 88mm shell that would finally pierce their hide, for the fiery death that would end it. He closed his eyes, listening to the two sounds of his world, Shachmatist's shallow, hitched breathing, and Medved's low, exhausted groans from the driver's pit. The seconds stretched, thick and silent. Then, from the distance, a new sound arrived. Not the sharp crack of a direct hit, nor the deep-throated roar of the railway gun. It was a different kind of thunder, a deep, rolling, crumping series of explosions, muffled by distance, but heavy, with finality. It was the sound of something large and complex coming apart. The sound was followed, not by the expected retaliatory strike, but by a startling, absolute cessation of all incoming fire. The 88mm did not shoot again. The silence that descended was different from all the others. It was not the tense quiet of anticipation, nor the dead quiet of a vacuum. It was the expansive, echoing silence of a concluded event. A silence that allowed the outside world to seep back in. The whisper of the wind across the cratered field, the distant, panicked cry of a single bird. A wild, impossible thought, too dangerous to entertain, clawed at Stvol's mind. He dragged himself up, wincing at the blaze of pain from his ribs, and pressed his eye to the least damaged periscope. The view was twilight blue and smoke gray. At the distant railway embankment, a new, darker plume was rising, thick and oily, tinged with orange from within. It was not the clean steam of the locomotive. It was the smoke of a catastrophic fire. The long, angular silhouette of the railway gun was no longer clean against the sky. It was canted at a strange, broken angle. Figures, tiny as ants, were scattering away from it in chaos. Their shot, their blind, desperate, mathematically impossible shot with the wrong type of shell. It had not merely landed close. By some freak of ballistics, some twist of fate earned by Suriga's final pivot of the hull, it had found a mark. Perhaps it had struck the ammunition tender. Perhaps it had hit the delicate traverse mechanism or the foundation of the gun itself. It didn't matter. The Titan had been wounded. Its terrible purpose had been interrupted. But the true change was closer. On the field before them, the German infantry was in full, undisguised retreat. Not the tactical withdrawal after their ambush, but a rout. Men were abandoning positions, running not just away from the tank, but toward the rear, their cohesion broken. The shock of the railway guns' silencing, combined with the unnatural, ghostly persistence of the Soviet tank, had shattered their will. The myth of their invincible hammer was broken, and with it, their resolve to deal with the unkillable anvil. Stvol watched, disbelief hardening into a painful, weary understanding. They had done it, not just survived. They had, in their final act, changed the tactical picture. The crossroads behind them might still be open. Time lost meaning again. The twilight deepened into proper night. The only light inside the tank came from the dying glow of the electrical fires on the railway embankment, casting long, eerie shadows through the cracks in their armor. No one came for them. They were alone in a ring of silent victory. It was the deep of the night when new sounds arrived. Not German. The rumble of engines had a different pitch. The crunch of tracks on the ruined road was familiar. Soviet voices, cautious at first, then growing in number and volume, called out to each other. A probing light, then another, swept across the field from the east. The beams played over the wrecked Panzer IV, over the German dead, and finally came to rest on the hulking, shadowed form of the IS-2. The beams froze. The voices fell silent. From his perch, Stvol saw them, the infantry of their reinforcements, the men they had been sent to hold the line for. They approached not with the brisk stride of liberators, but with the slow, reverent steps of men approaching a sacred relic. Their faces, illuminated in the back glow of their own lanterns, were not expressions of joy, but of awe and of horror. They saw the tank. They saw the monstrous dinner-plate-sized crater on its forehead. The metal flowed and re-solidified like volcanic rock. They saw the dozens of other scars from the 88mm and the smaller arms. They saw the frozen, twisted posture of the hull, the dead track. They saw a thing that by all laws of war and physics should not exist. The Soviet soldiers formed a loose, silent circle around the tank. No one called out. No one tried to open the hatches. They simply stared, their weapons lowered, as if in the presence of something that transcended battle. This was the final, unspoken victory. They had become more than a crew, more than a tank. They had become a story, a testament, an icon. Inside, Stvol heard the footsteps on the hull, the tentative scrape of a hand on metal. He looked at Medved, who gave a faint, exhausted nod. He looked toward Shakhmatist, who sat quietly in his blindness, listening to the voices of his people. With the last of his will, Stvol reached up with his good arm. He grasped the handle of the commander's hatch. It was warped, jammed. He put his weight against it. It resisted, then gave with a scream of deformed metal. The hatch clanged open. Cold, clean night air flooded the compartment, washing over them like a balm, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. overwhelming the stench of death and cordite. It was the first free breath they had taken in an eternity. Stvol did not climb out. He simply rested his head against the hatch rim, his face pale and gaunt in the moonlight, streaked with blood and soot, his eyes reflecting the distant fire. A young Soviet lieutenant, his face a mask of disbelief, stepped forward, his lantern raised. The beam illuminated Stvol's broken form, the dark interior behind him, the shadows of the others. No one saluted. No one cheered. The lieutenant slowly, deliberately removed his helmet. Around him, one by one, the other soldiers did the same. It was not a military gesture. It was a funeral rite, a homage. The Ivan the Terrible had held its position. At all costs. The crew had performed their duty. To the end. The miracle was not that they had survived a direct hit from a railway gun. The miracle was what they had become in the process. A permanent, unshakable legend, forged in steel and blood, silent and immense under the cold Prussian stars. The icon had earned its silence.